This time we're talking about photosynthesis, which is the overarching topic in Chapter 10. Photosynthesis happens in plants mostly, but also happens in some single-cell organisms. For the most part, in this particular discussion, we're going to refer to plants. But please understand that there are other organisms that can photosynthesize. For example, some algae and some unicellular eukaryotes, as well as some prokaryotes. But mostly it's plants. And what happens is, in general, is light energy is turned into chemical energy, then that energy is stored in the form of a starch or a sugar. And that starch or sugar is for utilization of the plant in some way. The image you have here on the left is a tomato plant. I think that's what they're trying to draw. And so this stored form of energy in the tomato is actually to feed the seeds. So we think of it as yummy tomatoes, but it actually is the plant doing this to feed the seeds to basically propagate the species. It's all for these properties that we studied actually back into Chapter 1, so that this particular plant, it's the way this particular plant can pass on its genetic information. The chemistry of photosynthesis, you take in carbon dioxide, 6 CO2s, 6 waters, H2O, light, and the chlorophyll, that which makes plant green, is what captures that light and turn it into sugar and oxygen. We will refer more or less to that particular chemical formula throughout this whole chapter, but boom, there you have it right there to start out with regard to the chemical formula for photosynthesis. The definition of photosynthesis is the process that converts sunlight to energy. And indirectly or directly, whichever way you want to put that, photosynthesis is what nourishes the entire living world. Photosynthesis is done by what's known as autotrophs. Autotrophs can sustain themselves without eating anything else. The unfortunate thing about autotrophs is somebody else eats them, and that's the nourishing the entire world. We consider plants photoautotrophs because they're feeding themselves, auto meaning self, and then troph feeding. They're feeding themselves via light energy. And so autotrophs derive organisms or eat anything derived from don't eat anything derived from other organisms. They're producers. So we think of autotrophs as the producers, and they create organic molecules out of inorganic molecules. So CO2, so carbon dioxide, even though it has a carbon in it, is still considered an inorganic molecule. But the plant takes in sunlight, also CO2, and can convert that to sugar. All plants, almost all plants, are photoautotrophs. It's really difficult to say all in biology because as soon as you say that, I've said this in class, as soon as you say that, there is an exception. Make the organic molecules from water and carbon dioxide. And then, as I said, can also occur in algae, some protists, and some prokaryotes. Not too many. And over here on the right, in the middle there, you're going to see your paramecium that everybody tried to draw. You see some algae. You also see some cyanobacteria. That's the bottom right. And then, of course, at the top, you see plants. Pretty familiar with those. A little bit of compare and contrast, because you probably know by now that compare and contrast are some pretty easy ways to ask questions. Autotrophs make their own food and include plants, some protists, some bacteria. Heterotrophs, and that's that term, I don't know if that term showed up on the previous slide, cannot make their own food. Now, heterotrophs obtain their energy from other organisms. They're considered the consumers. And please understand, we're heterotrophs, as well as fungi are heterotrophs. Some bacteria are heterotrophs. So this consuming of food can happen in many different ways. Certainly some bacteria are decomposers, and that decomposing is the eating. So we kind of need to expand our idea of what consuming is. Anything that actually is not making its own food, or making its own organic compounds. I guess I might even just put it there, because sometimes you can think of a bacteria and it's decomposing organic matter, that it more or less is making its own food because it's actually changing that organic matter, but it's not making the organic matter. And so with regard to these autotrophic behaviors, you have photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. It is, just a little bit of a distinction there. Photosynthesis, sunlight to produce sunlight and CO2 to produce organic molecules in water. Excuse me. And chemoautotrophs use energy from oxidation of inorganic substances to synthesize organic compounds. And this sometimes this is not as common. You have sulfur oxidizing bacteria, and then also certain things that can oxidize aluminum to nitrates. So you have other type. With regard to this sulfur bacteria, I am not overly familiar with this concept of swamp gas, particularly down in Florida, but this would be an area where you have this swamp gas. Certainly in all of my reading, swamp gas is often talked about with regard to creating an atmosphere, certainly for horror films, etc. But those of you who are more familiar with Florida than myself probably know something about swamp gas, and that's the bacteria oxidizing sulfur. There's another compare and contrast between photosynthesis and cell respiration. Many ways, I think the chapter on cell respiration preps your head for this. This is a completely different reaction. There are many differences, but you see, in my mind, there, as we said about cell respiration, they're opposite sides of the same coin. So even though they're opposite sides, they're still within the same realm, I guess I might say. I think it becomes a little more user-friendly to see them beside each other and learn them one right after the other. Both plant and animals carry out respiration, but only plant cells photosynthesize. So both plants and animals do the cell respiration, and actually using oxygen to create ATP plus give off water. Both processes utilize the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis for ATP production. So those are areas where they're similar. Differences: photosynthesis reduces carbon dioxide to carbohydrates and releases oxygen, and respiration utilizes oxygen and gives off CO2. So that's where definitely you have those opposite sides of the same coin. So looking at the image here, the left side is the photosynthesis side, the right side is the cell respiration side. Photosynthesis happens in something that we haven't introduced yet, but this thylakoid membrane. Water is converted to oxygen ATP is created. In the cristae of the mitochondria, oxygen is converted to water, ATP is created. And then if you drop down to the middle part of the image, you have light reactions coming into what looks like these stacks of green things. They happen to be where the chlorophyll is. Those stacks of green things, which are called grana, create this electron carrier, which is NADH. That electron carrier then can go into the Calvin cycle, and throughout the Calvin cycle, a carbohydrate can be made as well, and carbon can be fixed, and a carbohydrate can be made as well as ATP. With regard to the right side, just to review, in the cell membrane, glycolysis is done, which actually breaks that 6-carbon sugar into a 2-carbon, then goes into the citric acid cycle. After one of those carbon breaks off and it goes and acetyl-CoA attaches, that turns the cycle, that creates that electron carrier. That electron carrier then is sent to the electron transport chain, which creates ATP. And at the end of the electron transport chain, that's where the that electron is finally given off to oxygen and removed from the whole cell or from the whole plant via H2O. Then you have at the bottom the two, simplified reactions. One of the differences with regard to the electron carrier in photosynthesis, you have NADPH. That then is turned into NADP with as a positive ion, and then on the cellular respiration, NAD positive ion is then turned into NADH. In photosynthesis, this happens in the stroma, cellular respiration in the matrix, and at the bottom of that image, you have CO2 being turned into CH2O, and then in cellular respiration, that same CH2O that was just made in photosynthesis then can turn into CO2. And you kind of see the way these two processes rely on each other. Leaves are the major location of photosynthesis. It probably was something that you already came to this chapter knowing. The green color is from chlorophyll, the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts. And so what happens, the chlorophyll absorbs the light because of special pigments that are able to capture that light, then drives the synthesis of the organic molecules in the chloroplast. And so maybe just before we go too much further, you have a leaf, and what we've done is we've blown the leaf up there to the right. You have a cross section of a leaf. You have your chloroplasts. You have a vein. That vein can bring water and anything else, nutrients to the plant. You have at the bottom of this leaf cross section stomata, sorry, I put an R in there, and that is the way that carbon dioxide can get in. Carbon dioxide is that inorganic carbon that we're going to turn into to organic carbon, and oxygen can get out. And then at the bottom you have your stacks of granum, and then you also have your mesophyll cell. So CO2 enters and exits, CO2 enters, CO2 and O2 exits through the stroma. And then chloroplasts are mainly found in cells of the mesophyll and the chloroplast. Many chloroplasts in each mesophyll cell. The chlorophyll is in membranes of thylakoids. We will pick this up on the next one. I'm running out of time.